Hello, my name is Jeremy, and my partner Andrew and myself have researched how ethics have been involved during the Civil Rights era. Our research will primarily focus on the business practices towards African Americans and minorities during a time in U.S. history where separate was not necessarily equal. We will review the history of businesses and corporations and consider some of the ethical rights they may have. Afterwards, we will interview a civil rights historian, Dr. Charles Bolton, and discover his insights on the subject. Finally, we will see the lasting impacts of these business practices on the African American community and corporations as a whole.
Businesses and corporations have been around almost as long as people have. At first, businesses used goods for trade through the use of a bartering system. This concept of trading the business's goods for different items was used until about 3,000 years ago when the concept of money was introduced. Originally, businesses were small in size and usually family-owned and operated. Then, around the 1600s, some of these businesses grew to enormous sizes, creating the first corporations. When corporations first started, they created charters, clearly defining the purpose of the corporations as well as how the corporation would be operated. These charters served as the rules for the corporation, causing owners to make decisions that were regulated by the corporation's charter. However, this began to change when the 14th Amendment was put into effect. Corporations took advantage of the 14th Amendment to grant themselves rights. This resulted in corporations no longer requiring strict regulation, but instead having rights similar to people. Today, corporations have many of the rights U.S. citizens do, and have used these to increase the size and power of the corporation.
There are two main theories to consider before we go further into the history of the corporations. Managers of a corporation, also known as the CEO, are in charge of the everyday big decisions of a corporation. These managers are entrusted to control the business and are hired by a board of directors. One theory to consider is the stockholder theory. Under this, the actions of the CEO are expected to reflect the interests of the owners of the corporation, or the stockholders. Therefore, the actions of the CEO should be to increase the stockholders' profits. The next theory to consider is the stakeholder theory. With this, CEOs are expected to act in a way that reflects the interests of the stakeholders. This could be anyone who has a stake in the company, such as stockholders or owners, employees, customers, and the community of the businesses within. However, this does not include the competitors of the business who may be hurt by their success and profits. Following this theory, the actions of the CEO should result in better work experiences for employees, profits for the owners, and a positive environment for the community around it. These two theories differ greatly and can sometimes make it unclear of how a CEO should act in a corporation.
When the 14th Amendment was introduced, corporations took advantage of it to gain rights for themselves. This is likely due to former U.S. Senator Roscoe Conkling, who helped draft the 14th Amendment, then left the Senate to practice law. He then argued in San Mateo County v. Southern Pacific Railroad to the Supreme Court, where he claimed the 14th Amendment did not mean only people, but also corporations. To defend this claim, he cited back to when he was drafting the amendment, stating that he and other drafters specifically chose person rather than citizen for the sole purpose of being able to cover corporations. The Supreme Court agreed with him, and by the time he came back to the Supreme Court for Santa Clara County v. Southern Pacific Railroad, all of the members of the Supreme Court agreed that the 14th Amendment included corporations.
While some people think that African Americans were treated unfairly by everyone, in actuality, there were many non-minorities that supported equality among the races. In some cases, people demanded that blacks be given responsible jobs that had originally been denied to them. In industry, many black workers were denied promotions, pay raises, or trainings that would better their abilities for their business. In support of equal working rights, both whites and blacks would boycott local businesses who refused to hire fairly or treat black workers with the same respect they would with white workers. During the Civil Rights Movement, there began federal legislation that attempted to outlaw discrimination in business practices. These efforts were not greatly effective, but did have some positive results. An example of this could be found in South Carolina, a heavily segregated state at the time. Between 1963 and 1970, employment of black workers within the textile companies increased from about 5% of the total staff to over 20%. This resulted in what is known as the reverse migration, in which many African Americans returned to the South for work. So, in relation to the 14th Amendment, why was there such a lack of cases from African Americans in comparison to corporations seeking legal rights?
Well, I think that partly it was the nature of the Supreme Court, which had decided to both interpret the 14th Amendment very narrowly, but also be pretty activist in, kind of creating this concept of economic due process, where it said that in the 14th Amendment that person could also be defined as a corporation. But I think the court and the country as a whole was pretty much not very sympathetic to the issue of equal rights for blacks. And yet at the same time, you had this industrial revolution going on, and corporations were complaining that states that were trying to regulate them were cutting into their profits. And so the due process clause was used to define, that any kind of effort to reduce the so-called reasonable profit of a corporation could be a violation of the due process clause. So it was kind of the way that the Supreme Court interpreted it, which and earlier there had been cases in the 1870s and 1880s where they'd kind of narrowed the definition of the 14th Amendment in terms of protecting African Americans.
Do you believe that the decision of the Supreme Court was more based off the interests of the stockholders or their own personal prejudice towards possibly decreasing pay for African American workers?
I mean, I think that they probably were more interested in, protecting the shareholders. I mean, I think that period of the court, again, going back to the late 19th century, was one of kind of promoting business at every opportunity. I also think that case, that Ford actually thought that he was actually doing both. He was the first employer to pay his workers $5 a day and to give them weekends off.
Right.
And the reason why is because he thought that if he did that, his workers could buy his cars, and he would in the end make more money. And so I think that his idea was that he could do both. He could help the stakeholders, I guess it is the term you're using. He could help the stakeholders, not only his employees but his future customers, and at the same time he could increase profits.
Okay.
I don't think he saw. I mean, I know that he was. Other companies thought that what he was doing was, radical in some ways, but in his mind, I think he thought he was doing both.
Okay.
And doing it effectively.
So during the 20th century, many businesses would refuse service to African Americans or even segregate these businesses. Based off of this, what were some of the effects of these practices on the community as a whole? So as in, how did the communities around these businesses react to businesses' actions of segregation or discrimination?
Well, there's kind of a couple ways to look at that. On the one hand, when blacks were segregated, one thing they started doing was building up their own communities. And so in an odd way, it actually sometimes helped black business owners because they could build up their own businesses and cater to their own communities.
Right.
But also had a negative impact that, it also limited kind of what blacks had access to, what services. And of course, we're moving as a society to a more kind of consumer-oriented society. And so that's why you get things like black boycotts, trying to gain access to, white kind of owned businesses. But it kind of cut both ways. I mean, I think on the one hand, for white owners, I mean, they're basically shooting themselves in the foot because they're basically saying, this part of the population is not going to be a customer.
Yep.
And on the other hand, it did help in some sense some black business owners. And when segregation ended, you saw those kind of black business districts in towns just kind of die and wither away because those kind of separate services weren't needed anymore. Yet during World War II, you have on the one hand all this government money going in to fund the war effort, and at the same time we're fighting a war against kind of the ultimate racist, Adolf Hitler. And so the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which was formed in 1941, was really the first effort by the federal government to try to end that kind of discrimination. But it was pretty not that effective. It was kind of like they encouraged people to do it, but they didn't really enforce it that much. I would say that it's a gradual thing that the federal government increasingly becomes more interested in protecting black rights, starting particularly in the 1940s, and it takes a while until the 1960s when that really kind of comes to fruition.
In response to the lack of cases from African Americans in comparison to corporations, Dr. Bolton indicated that while the country gave African Americans rights, many people were still prejudiced against them. Since it was during the Industrial Revolution, the majority of the country was focused on the progression and development of businesses and corporations rather than equal rights. In relation to the Dodge v. Ford Motor Company being interested in stockholders or prejudice, Dr. Bolton seemed to believe that the Supreme Court acted on behalf of the stockholders. This is likely because Ford was interested in collecting the money that he paid his employees by having them buy his cars. Finally, in response to the effects of segregation from businesses as a whole, Dr. Bolton mentioned that while the government created the Fair Employment Practices Committees to reduce segregation, it was not enforced. This created black communities similar to white communities, but black businesses were not as successful, especially in the South.